Stop everything you're doing. What you're about to hear is not a history lesson, not a protest chant, and not another polite discussion about inequality. It's a fire burning across continents, ignited by one man's voice in a dusty square in Burkina Faso, a voice that may just be speaking directly to your soul. His name is Ibrahim Trout, not a celebrity, not a politician in a suit, just a soldier with dirt on his boots and decades of pain in his voice. He doesn't speak from theory, he speaks from trenches. Trenches dug in Africa, trenches that echo with the cries from Detroit, from New Orleans, from Watts. And he doesn't whisper. He dares to say what others won't. What if everything you were taught about your limitations, your history, your future was designed to keep you small? That question isn't aimed at strangers. It's for family, for you, for anyone who has ever felt the sting of invisibility in a system they helped build. For every Black American who's ever marched, prayed, voted, organized, only to watch the cycle of pain repeat itself. This isn't about guilt. This is about power. The kind of power that gets buried under decades of disconnection between people who were never supposed to forget each other. So we ask you, what if the world has tried to separate you from the very continent that holds your key to healing? What if the most revolutionary act isn't protest, but reunion? If this message touches a part of you that's rarely spoken to, don't let it fade. Share this video with someone who still believes we are alone. And subscribe if you know deep down our future won't be handed to us, it must be built by us. He stood in a dusty square in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. No podium, no teleprompter, just a man with calloused hands and a voice carved by resistance. His name is Ibrahim Trout. And what he delivered that day wasn't a speech. It was a global awakening wrapped in plain language, delivered without apology, aimed straight at the heart of every Black person who's ever asked, why do we still suffer? Our pain may wear different costumes across continents, he said, but it all flows from the same poisoned well. Trout didn't speak like an academic. He spoke like someone who had sat in the back rooms of power and watched global empires operate behind closed doors. He saw the maps. He read the memos. He understood the unspoken strategies, how entire populations are treated like chess pieces, moved by men who've never stepped foot in the places they control. And he brought one simple message to light Black people across the globe are not oppressed by coincidence. They are oppressed by design. He went on to name the variations. In America, it's police violence, redlining, generational poverty, and school systems that bury truth. In Africa, it's IMF policies, land grabs, proxy wars, and economic extraction masked as development. In the Caribbean, it's debt traps, cultural erasure, and dependency disguised as tourism. In Europe, it's racial invisibility hidden behind polite denial and tokenism. But despite these differences, he emphasized that none of these are isolated struggles. Police brutality in Chicago, debt slavery in Chad, educational apartheid in London, land theft in South Africa. These are not separate events. These are branches of the same global system wearing different faces. At that moment, Trout's words moved beyond mere political rhetoric. He was laying out a spiritual and geopolitical map, one designed to help people across the Black world recognize each other not as strangers, but as family kept apart by centuries of engineered disconnection. He said it plainly. The greatest weapon they ever used was not the whip, not the bullet, not even economic dependency. It was division. The lie that we are separate, and then his gaze steadied into the camera as if speaking directly to a grandmother in Detroit, a student in London, a community leader in Kingston, and a farmer in Senegal. What if the very thing you've been missing your whole life is a continent that's been waiting for you to come home? But he wasn't talking about relocation. He was talking about reconnection to a lineage, a purpose, a power that transcends borders, passports, and imposed nationalities. This was no romanticism of Africa. Trout made it clear Africa is struggling, but it is also rising. And it's the only place, he said, where Black people can build complete sovereignty if they come not as tourists, not as investors, but as family. Then came the pivot, a powerful insight few dare to speak. Black Americans have what Africa needs: global visibility, financial power, and institutional experience. Africa has what Black Americans have been denied: land, spiritual continuity, and autonomous power. Divided, both remain vulnerable. United, they become the most formidable force the modern world has ever known. And then, like a preacher driving home the altar call, he dropped the line that shook the silence in the square. We must stop treating Africa as a faraway concept and start treating it as the other half of our body. It was not a suggestion. It was a charge. A call to remember what was taken. A call to reach beyond history's wounds and grab hold of a future forged in unity, not shame. In that moment, this wasn't just Ibrahim Trout speaking. It was every ancestor who crossed the Atlantic in chains, every elder who kept memory alive in whispers, every child who still wonders why their skin comes with such weight. And for those watching, especially in the United States, the unspoken question rose to the surface. If all the suffering we've endured has come from a global system, doesn't that mean our healing must be global too? As Ibrahim Trout's voice grew firmer, a visible shift spread through the crowd not just in Ouagadougou, but among those watching online in Harlem, Accra, Kingston, Brixton. This wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a mirror, and everyone listening began to see the same thing staring back. We are not victims by nature. We have simply been trained to forget our power. That was the breaking point. They have spent centuries trying to convince us we are nothing but survivors, he declared. But survival was never the goal. We were born to lead, to build, to liberate. This was the climax, the moment the message stopped being historical or ideological and became deeply personal. Trout wasn't just talking about geopolitics anymore. He was calling out the psychological battlefield, the war over identity, self-worth, and legacy. He named it clearly. The real chains now are psychological, not metal shackles, but self-doubt. Not plantation walls, but belief systems that tell us our story began with slavery. The new segregation isn't legal, it's algorithmic. Social media feeds, search engines, job platforms, all programmed to elevate fear and invisibility over truth and potential. The new colonialism wears a suit. It sits in boardrooms. It prints reports. It controls development aid and media narratives. It pretends to offer help while quietly extracting everything of value. And yet, in the face of all this, Trout smiled. Because we are still here, still rising, still turning pain into beauty, struggle into strategy. That is the miracle they could never kill. In this moment, the crowd in Burkina Faso erupted not in anger but in revelation. It was as if decades of separation collapsed into dust. As if the borders that had kept them distant from brothers and sisters in Baltimore or Brixton were nothing but paper. But beyond the applause, others were watching too, and not with joy. Trout's speech didn't go unnoticed. Within hours, snippets of the livestream began disappearing from certain platforms. Misinformation, they labeled it. Accounts sharing the full video were flagged, shadow banned, throttled. A tech executive later admitted anonymously, it wasn't what he said, it was how it made people feel. That kind of unity is disruptive. In government circles, think tanks scrambled to analyze the implications. One diplomat from a European capital reportedly said, if this narrative spreads, Africa won't just rise economically. It will lead a global ideological shift. That changes everything. Western media, when they did mention Trout's speech, downplayed its significance. They called it passionate, controversial, idealistic. But they dared not engage with its core truth, that unity among Black people across continents would reshape the global order. Meanwhile, the African diaspora reacted with fire. In New York, a group of students at an HBCU organized a week-long teach-in titled Beyond the Chains, What Trout Taught Us. In London, Caribbean youth re-uploaded the video on blockchain platforms so it couldn't be erased. In Lagos, a local radio host interrupted his music program to play a 20-minute excerpt on air. In São Paulo, a community organization renamed their headquarters Casa de Reconnection, House of Reconnection. But perhaps the most poignant response came from a 76-year-old Black Vietnam veteran in Alabama who commented on a community livestream, "I've waited my whole life to hear someone speak like this. We were never lost. We were kept apart on purpose. But now I see the road home." That was it. The turning point. Because once the lie of isolation breaks, once people start seeing themselves as part of a global family, not just citizens of disconnected nations, the entire logic of oppression begins to crumble. And that's exactly what they fear most. They have contingency plans for war, for economic collapse, even for climate disaster, Trout said. But they have no defense against a united people who know their worth and act with purpose. In that single sentence, the stakes crystallized. This wasn't just about Africa. It wasn't just about Black America. It was about the future of the global system and the deep growing crack forming beneath its foundations. Trout's words, once dismissed as radical, were now impossible to unhear. They echoed across classrooms, church halls, WhatsApp groups, and dining room tables. And for many listening, especially the elders who had marched, who had waited, who had bled, the feeling was overwhelming. This is the moment we've been waiting for. In the days following Ibrahim Trout's speech, something unusual happened, not just in the media, not just online, but in people's homes, schools, churches, and city councils. The aftershock wasn't measured in views or likes. It was measured in conversations, in legislation proposals, and in a deep personal question echoing in Black communities everywhere. What if we've been organizing in isolation when we were meant to organize as one? That question didn't just float in the air, it moved people. In Atlanta, a group of pastors launched a sermon series called The Diaspora and the Dream, integrating Trout's message into Black liberation theology. Elders wept during service not out of sadness, but out of recognition. In Baltimore, high school students began mapping their ancestry not for science fairs, but to understand what countries they were disconnected from. They pinned maps on the walls marked trade routes and wrote letters, real letters, to local leaders in Ghana and Senegal. In Chicago, barbershops and hair salons turned into think tanks. "You heard what that brother said from Burkina Faso," one woman replied. "He didn't just say it. He saw us." In Jamaica, a town council introduced a proposal to twin their parish with a rural district in Burkina Faso, not for symbolic diplomacy, but for direct cultural and agricultural collaboration. Suddenly, local issues began taking on continental context. Economic justice, now tied to cocoa and coltan. School curriculum reform, now questioning why children still read about Rome before Timbuktu. Mental health discussions, now grounded in historical trauma and intergenerational resilience. We are not broken people. One Chicago teacher said to her class, "We are fractured, and healing begins when we see the whole." Across the political spectrum, Trout's speech became a problem that couldn't be ignored. Conservative think tanks warned that it promoted Pan-African socialism and anti-Western narratives. One senator even introduced a bill to defund any U.S.-based organization seen promoting foreign allegiance over national unity. But progressives were caught off guard. Many had spoken for years about systemic racism, but few were prepared to reframe civil rights as a global issue. Trout's call wasn't asking for better treatment inside existing systems. He was calling for new systems altogether rooted in sovereignty, legacy, and self-determination. In response, a group of Black congressional staffers organized a closed-door session titled African Diaspora and American Foreign Policy. Mayors from majority Black cities opened informal dialogues with African embassies. In New York, a quiet but significant proposal emerged: a municipal diaspora commission to create economic, educational, and cultural links with African cities outside the federal level. Meanwhile, African leaders began to feel the ripple too. In Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, newspapers published op-eds titled, "Is Trout Right? Has Africa ignored its children abroad for too long?" Some criticized Trout's tone. Others called his speech impractical. But a few began to ask the real question: if we don't build these bridges now, who will? In Burkina Faso, the government remained silent, but state-run media re-aired the speech 3 times in 1 week. The implication was clear. Trout had said what many officials were thinking, but could not say aloud. In schools across the U.S., especially those with Afrocentric or charter curricula, Trout's name became part of classroom debate. Was he a visionary? A radical, a truth-teller? One teacher in Oakland printed the speech and assigned it next to Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail and Malcolm X's ballot or the bullet. "Read them all," she told her seniors. "Then tell me what's changed, what hasn't, and where do you stand?" The conversations that followed were unlike anything those students had experienced. No one asked for grades. They asked for action. One student said, "I've always wondered why we marched alone. Now I know we weren't supposed to." Perhaps the most significant impact wasn't external, but internal. Trout shattered what generations had been taught to believe: that liberation was local, that injustice was circumstantial, that the African continent was a place of need, not a center of strength. The psychological shift was subtle but seismic. For elders, a sense of closure and rebirth. For youth, a map out of despair. For activists, a language that finally linked their pain to a larger plan. He spoke like someone who remembered what we had forgotten, one grandmother in Mississippi said. and reminded us we've never been alone. In Washington, D.C., the reaction to Ibrahim Trout's speech was not televised, but it was felt. Inside foreign policy circles, intelligence briefings began circulating under the label Diaspora Realignment Risk. The phrase was cold bureaucratic, but it revealed a quiet alarm. What happens if Black Americans stop seeing themselves as an American minority and start acting as a global majority? At the State Department, one official reportedly asked, "Is this a fringe movement or the beginning of something transnational?" The truth was, it was already both. Across the American political landscape, Trout's message posed a challenge no platform had prepared for. It wasn't a demand for reform, it was a call to reimagine allegiance, identity, and power. In the United States, a mirror, not a threat among Black communities, especially elders who remembered the Garvey era or the echoes of Pan-Africanism in the 60s. Trout's voice was not foreign. It was familiar. He speaks like Malcolm, but this time he's calling us home, said a retired professor in Philadelphia. Civil rights veterans saw in Trout the next evolution of a movement paused, not broken by time and politics. But for mainstream institutions, his speech raised uncomfortable questions. What would it mean if African Americans began organizing outside traditional party structures? What if they began investing literally and politically in African institutions instead of Western ones? It was a confrontation with the unspoken fear of American soft power losing one of its most loyal but wounded engines: the Black vote, the Black dollar, the Black cultural influence. Yet Trout didn't preach abandonment. He preached strategic reconnection. "We are not leaving America," one community leader in Atlanta said. "We are expanding our definition of what it means to be whole." In Paris, young Black French organizers began quoting Trout in community meetings. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian artists wrote verses inspired by the phrase, "We are not scattered seeds. We are roots of the same tree," but not all responses were hopeful. In London, a conservative columnist called the speech a dangerous new form of ethno-nationalism. In South Africa, some warned that reviving Pan-African unity could reignite dormant tribal tensions. And in Beijing and Moscow, silence. Trout's call for a self-determined sovereign Black global identity didn't fit comfortably within the agendas of any superpower. But for everyday people, teachers, parents, workers, elders, the message struck differently. It wasn't about overthrowing a system. It was about no longer asking it for permission, and that perhaps is what made it revolutionary. By the time Ibrahim Trout uttered his final words, the crowd stood in silence, not out of confusion, but out of reverence. Some had tears in their eyes, others clutched their chests as if something ancient had been shaken loose inside them. "This is not a revolution of noise," he said. "It is a revolution of memory, of recognition, of return." And then he looked directly into the camera, into the hearts of every Black American watching, and asked, "Will you answer the call?" It was more than rhetoric. It was a line in the sand. Because this moment, the one Trout called the global Black reckoning, isn't guaranteed to last. The forces that have spent centuries dividing, distracting, and disarming the African world will not go quietly. They are already repositioning, rebranding dependency as development, selling algorithms as access, offering symbols instead of power. And if we fail to act, if we once again fall for the illusion of progress while the roots remain poisoned, we may lose this window. And our grandchildren will ask, "Why did you stay silent when the path was finally clear?" That's the warning, but it's also the invitation. Because never before have we had the tools to connect across oceans in real time. Never before have African governments spoken openly about continental sovereignty. Never before have so many young Black people on every continent begun to question the version of history they were taught. Trout wasn't just speaking to governments, he was speaking to families, to you, to the grandmother who still holds stories from Alabama, to the veteran who marched with Dr. King but wonders if it made a difference, to the retiree who watches the news and feels that something is wrong but can't name it. He was speaking to every Black American who ever felt like they belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. And he was saying, "You are not lost. You were taken. And now you are being called back, not to a place, but to a purpose." So the question is not rhetorical, it is generational. Will you cross the bridge, or will you wait for a system that has never welcomed you to suddenly change? If you believe that true Black liberation must be global, leave a comment below. If you feel the call home, share this video with someone you love. And if you believe the future will not be given, but built, subscribe. This isn't about nostalgia. This is about destiny.